Hello, history students. Today we're going to be doing notes 4.4, World War II on the Homefront. Your essential question: how were American lives affected by the war? So, in the United States during World War II, our president, FDR, um, issued Executive Order, 9066. This was the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans. So Japanese Americans were relocated from many of their places that they were living on the West Coast into these relocation camps. You can see these relocation camps were further inland in California, in Idaho, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado. These Japanese citizens were taken to these relocation centers. They were relocated into these camps so they could be closely monitored at all times. They were forced to sell their grocery stores, their businesses, their homes, their cars, everything that they couldn't take with them in a suitcase, they had to sell or get rid of, which means they were not getting the full amount for anything that their businesses, their homes, their cars were worth because they had to sell them immediately. Many of these people were born in the United States, were American citizens. They were forced to pack up all their belongings, young, old, everyone who was of Japanese descent, and move out. There was a Supreme Court case about this very issue. So, Executive Order 9066 was challenged in the Supreme Court case Korimatsu versus the United States. But the Supreme Court verified that they believed that this was necessary to intern over 110,000 Japanese Americans during this time. It took more than 40 years for the United States to admit their fault, to admit that they were wrong in this situation, and they began to make reparations of $20,000 to each person who had survived living in those camps. Now, this $20,000 wouldn't buy you a car, wouldn't buy you a business, wouldn't replace your home, but it was something that the government could do to try to apologize for what they had done. Unfortunately, this didn't happen until the 1980s, so many of the people who had already been interned in these camps had passed away. And they did this because of Pearl Harbor. Remember, on Pearl Harbor's military base, we were attacked December 7th, 1941, by the Japanese. But we were also still at war in Europe at the same time, and we were not restricting anyone of German or Italian ancestry, even though we were fighting both of those people. So we were restricting who could immigrate into the United States during this time. You may remember Anne Frank. You probably read her book Diary of Anne Frank either in English in high school or in middle school. Anne Frank was a young 13-year-old girl who was Jewish. Her family had moved to Amsterdam to try to escape the Nazis in Germany. And unfortunately, her family was found and they were sent to concentration camps. Her diary during that time was published, and we know her story. But Anne Frank's father actually wrote to the United States numerous times pleading for permission to immigrate with his family, pleading for refugee status. They wanted to seek asylum here in the United States. They wanted to come here from religious persecution. But unfortunately, those pleas were ignored. Following World War I, Congress passed the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, which set up a quota system on how many people were going to allow to the United States and discouraged the immigration of what they call undesirables. So these were Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants, people that we did not want coming to the United States. Rosie the Riveter was posted up. She was an advertisement to encourage women to fight in the war effort. So men went off and fought in the war, but women were needed to be able to create the tanks, the ships, the guns, all the war materials in the factories for us to be able to win the war. So this is a riveter here. It's kind of like a big gun that attaches the metal pieces together on these planes, these tanks, these ships. All of these planes here created by Rosie's, by Riveters. At this time, we also had the Great Migration. Remember, we had the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South during this time. They continued to move in the 1940s and 1950s, and they came over to these places where we had all these factories creating these war materials. In California, we also had the Bracero program, which brought Mexican workers to the United States. So we had them come from Mexico to work in our agricultural industries. This one on the right here, this is actually the original Rosie the Riveter, in case you've never seen this poster here on the right. She is the less famous of the Rosie the Riveter posters, but she was actually the original. She was what the Rosie the Riveter poster was based off of. This woman is actually a riveter, but this original cover of the New York Post here, this picture was seen as too masculine. So she wasn't wearing makeup, she had strong muscular arms, and she wasn't seen as quite as feminine. That's why they created the more feminized version of Rosie for the advertisements. You can see the difference here. She's wearing makeup, she has nail polish on. But there was lots of propaganda to get women to join the workforce to come and help create these war materials. Here in the Bay Area, they worked on massive ships. They worked on tanks. This image here is of the Bay Area where they were working. And there's a memorial to all the Rosies that picked up and were able to create these war materials for us in Richmond, of California, in the Bay Area. But women also served in the military. The WASPs were Air Force service pilots. So these were female pilots to help out in the war. So actually, this woman here, Jackie Cochran, she was a famous female pilot. She was already setting records before the war had started, and she met with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and she suggested that the women could help out, that women could fly planes, they could help out in the war. And so they began to take over non combat duties in the military. The women served as Air Force service pilots. They would take the planes and they would fly them over to Europe, and then they would hand the planes off to the soldiers who needed them for the war. Jackie Cochran was the first woman to be able to be allowed to fly one of these military aircrafts across the Atlantic, although she wasn't allowed to handle takeoff or landing, but she was able to fly the plane the rest of the way. The WAC is the Women's Auxiliary Corporation. So, the Women's Auxiliary Corps, sorry, they took over nonviolent jobs in the military. So, this are all the other jobs that we need in the military to be able to finish the job and get it done. So, things like administrative duties, um, engineering, budgeting, intelligence, doing the laundry and mailing, handling motion pictures. We had a lot of advertisements that were created by the military at this time. They handled motor transportation, photography, postal services, supply, secretary work, all of these different jobs. There were more than 200,000 women that served in over 200 different jobs in the military. So these are just some lists of the jobs that women could do during this time. Plenty of jobs to do in the military that aren't combat roles. And like I mentioned earlier, we had the Bracero program here in California and on the West Coast. We had more than 200,000 Mexicans come to the United States to work as farmers, so they replaced the labor shortage that we were missing out on due to the war. Unfortunately, once they came here to the United States, they did suffer through some pretty terrible working conditions. They had low wages, long hours, they weren't given water breaks, restrooms out in the fields. Many companies were cheating them out of their portion of the wages. We also had Mexicans serve during the war. So we had Mexican Americans join up and serve in the army during World War II. And they also worked in the shipyards creating ships in LA during World War II. So the Bracero program actually started in World War II, but lasted up until 1964. So this was an agreement between Mexico and the United States to bring agricultural workers in. They were guaranteed basic human rights, so sanitation, shelter, food, and their minimum wage was 3 cents an hour back in 1942. But they were forced to work under very unsafe conditions. They were also forced to accept uns, unequal wages. They weren't actually getting paid the 3 cents that they were promised. They were getting paid in equal wages to their white counterparts. They couldn't really say anything to fight back against this either because they weren't US citizens. So if they said anything about the people not paying them properly, the employer could revoke their permit and deport them back to Mexico. So this program spanned over 22 years, and of the total 22 years, we had more than 1.5 million guest workers come to the United States and help feed our nation during a time of crisis. Braceros here in this picture are seen undergoing medical inspections before they were allowed into the United States. They were also sprayed with pesticides. This was known as a disinfection along the US Mexico border, and it continued until the 1950s. And of course, now we know that if you spray pesticides on a person, that can cause all kinds of cancer, long term illnesses. So that's things that we don't do anymore, of course, but some terrible treatment that we made the Mexicans suffer through when they came to the United States to help us out. So, in spite of their contributions, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were facing discrimination in LA. The Zoot Suit riots happened in 1943, and we're going to do a homework assignment about the Zoot Suit riots. We're going to learn a little more about them after our notes today. So, in June of 1943, a group of servicemen were on leave. So, they were military members, they were on leave, and they said that they had been assaulted by a group of Mexicans in a gang. So this was in East LA. There was a large Mexican population. There still is a large Mexican population in East LA. And they started to attack all the men that they found wearing these zoot suits. So zoot suits were kind of like the fashion of the time. There were these large suits. They were kind of long, baggy suits. So they were going around town, these sailors, and they were going to find anyone that they saw wearing a zoot suit, and they started to attack any men wearing a zoot suit. They would rip off the suits, they would burn them in the streets. The police intervened by arresting Mexican American youth. So they arrested the teenagers who were wearing these zoot suits. Here you can see the suits, kind of baggy, larger suits. And they arrested them for disturbing the peace. So African Americans, Filipino Americans would suffer the same fate as the Mexican Americans. They were being discriminated against during that time as well. So several hundred of these zoot suiters and just 9 sailors were arrested for all of the fighting that occurred within the next few days. Of the 9 sailors that were arrested, 8 of them were released with no charges, and only one had to pay a small fine. So the military actually had to come and intervene by June 7th, and they declared LA was off limits to all military personnel because of these fights. And in the United States today, we are still using immigrants in our war effort. We have what we call green card soldiers. So today, we have over 40,000 soldiers serving in the Army, and there are as many as half the Latinos that were killed in Iraq. So African Americans started coming back from the war. The Tuskegee Airmen who had served in the war, they did come back, and unfortunately, they were still not treated equally in society either. And we're going to learn about the end of the war next in our next set of notes. So don't forget to write a summary about what you learned, a couple sentences.